Morning, everybody. I'm super excited to have Rick Wootten on the show. Rick, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be on the show.
Man, we go way back
I
before
was
even the
thinking
digit
about,
was invented.
yeah, I was thinking about that just the other day. It was like, man, when was the first time I met Sugata? What were we working on? And it was a different world back then. It's nothing like what it is today.
Totally. But it seems yesterday. I mean, it seems yesterday, you and I were at Sonic Wall and you were the web guy and we're like, what is this web guy? And I walk into your office one day and he was super excited. Apparently some startup in San Francisco came in and showed you some cool online email marketing and lead scoring tool. You were super excited. You remember the name of that company?
Yeah, that was Eloqua. That was
Eloquent.
very early days. I think they had just a handful of employees, and they were looking to get some of the first logos out the door. This was like late 2005, early 2006, I think.
20 years ago. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah. A lot has happened. So we're going to cover a lot. But I want to kind of go back to at that time. Web was still 1.0, right?
yeah.
What was it like? And then talk to me a little bit about how did you go from 1.0 to 2.0? And then we'll talk about kind of where we are and where we're going.
The funny thing is when the web took off was just as I was finishing my undergraduate degree. And my undergraduate degree is graphic design. I had these aspirations. I was going to go work for an agency. I was going to, go do the next advertising that, everybody was blown away by. But then I discovered the web kind of by accident. My roommate is a big nerd, and he was like, "Oh my God, check this out!" And I was a gamer, so we started playing games online, which then led me to looking at websites, and I ended up getting completely sucked into it. So I never really practiced as a graphic designer. I immediately got sucked into it wasn't even Web 1.0 yet. It was still early. Mosaic was a browser we were using, Netscape. It was like if you look at what we have today, it was honestly still in tools. It was not that very sophisticated. But then, fast forward to the time that we were together, Web 2.0 was kind of becoming a thing. And Web 2.0 was really about figuring out how to build businesses and how to do e-commerce online. And a big part of that ends up being relationships with customers. And that's where the advent of the whole marketing automation thing, which had been called database marketing in the past, became a thing. And like we were talking about, like that, we were an early adopter. We tried out this Eloqua thing. It was kind of sketch. Our CISO or our CTO was, they had somehow had a relationship there and introduced us. And honestly, it was cool. It shaped my career for probably the next 10 years. Playing around with marketing operations and figuring out how to build systems that could enable businesses to communicate more regularly and accurately and personalized to people. So it's a pretty exciting time, and that was really kind of part of the backbone of that whole Web 2.0 movement.
So did you actually start in digital marketing from day one, or what did you do? Like maybe, one step I skipped completely. I always have the guest introduce himself or herself, but since you
Sure.
and I go way back, I completely skipped that step. So I'm going to have you maybe do a little bit of introduction. You have an amazing background. So, talk to us about yourself a little bit, and then we'll kind of get into specific parts of it.
Okay, I appreciate that. Yeah, so my career started as coming out of an engineer family, and I really wanted to be a graphic designer. There's like a great Monty Python skit where the prince doesn't want to be a prince; he wants to sing out the window and do ballads. That was me. I wanted to break the pattern, and it didn't work. I am classically trained as a graphic designer. I know how to be a graphic designer, but I didn't have the innate talent that some other people have, and so I surround myself with those, which led me into becoming very quickly the technical person in the marketing team, which is where my DNA is for my family. And so anyway, so I came out of college. I jumped into working for creative agencies. I helped build a whole bunch of great websites. FedEx, when they started doing shipping and tracking online, American Airlines, when they started selling tickets through TED. I was really like fortunate to have been part of a bunch of these. Built one of the first virtual galleries for Thomas Kincaid back in the late 90s. Like really cool stuff. But kind of fast forward, but what I really wanted was to own something end to end. And so I left the agency world and I went to go work for this like tiny subdivision of 3Com called Palm. And not realizing just how big that company would become. I think I was employee number 384. We did $10 million that first year. And then we just accelerated over the next 5, 6 years, and IPO'd, one of the biggest IPOs at the time, and then went all the way through to selling it off to HP back around whatever it was, 2005, I believe, is when that happened. And that seeded this passion for me in growth companies and trying to do really creative things that make an impact, especially as it relates to pipeline and demand gen, that sort of thing. And it just pulled me in. Before that, I was like you said, the web guy, which, by the way, I just have to tell you this. I used to hate that people called me the web guy, because I did so much more. And then years later, I saw this video, and they said, anytime somebody says you're the blank guy or girl or whatever, it's the highest level of compliment. It means that you have an expertise somewhere. And I was like, okay, so I'll stop being egotistical and thinking that I'm more than web. And I kind of embraced it. But anyway, so I went from just doing all the web stuff to really doing business oriented stuff, which kind of took me through my career. A lot of growth marketing, a lot of demand generation, a lot of campaigns. And then through my career, I had like 3 IPOs and 2 acquisitions. I was part of Cloudflare when they went public. I was part of Sentinel One. I've really just kind of embraced that growth thing, and I've enjoyed it over the years. And PRM, CRM, anything to do with automation of all that has been a really big part of it because of my geek side. So now I've done just about every job in marketing, including CMO, and I don't know, you could say that I'm at the stage now where I get to pick and choose what I want to work on, and I keep coming back to the same thing. It's the growth marketing, it's the demand gen. Those are the areas that I have the most passion in.
That's amazing. So we're going to spend a lot about that growth marketing piece, but I want to go back to this web guy thing. You're absolutely right, because at the time when you came in and he took over, it was very amorphous to us, because we just looked at it as a catalog online that
Right.
some people came and browsed. And when we think about using the word demand gen, at that time, like 20 years ago, demand gen was predominantly twofold, right? For tech companies, events,
Yeah.
or some sort of dialing, and people occasionally advertised.
That's
And
right.
I think Barracuda changed the game into the tech space, where they took the whole go-to-market through partners, where they flooded the zones with consumer-centric or business-centric ads, created leads, gave it to the partners to recruit partners. They created a motion that I think the rest of us didn't have. And then we would all be envious about the web guy or web girl, because that was kind of where the leads came in. They came in through the web. They're
That's
no
right.
longer through events and phone calls. So can you talk a little bit about maybe the transition, how the channel started to shift or became multi-channel, sort of in 1.0 before we go to 2.0?
Yeah, that's a great point. I would say that if you go back to the early 2000s, really what it was is exactly what you said. You'd kind of go to market, maybe with some partners, but it's usually the salesperson cold calling in. If not, it was you had a phone number that somebody could dial and talk to you. And this advent of the idea, and now it just seems so common sense, but back then it was novel. This idea of putting a form on your website where you could capture interest, where somebody can contact you and you could respond to them almost in real time. And it got over the challenge that people had, where it's like, oh god, I don't want to call them, I don't want to listen to a pitch, I just want to know what the price list is, I just want to know where I can buy it. And so email or web forms became a really key part of doing that. The reason I was a little bit different coming into SonicWall was because I had come out of the BDC side. I had gone to work for Palm. I was in charge of the e-commerce for Palm. I was in charge of the database marketing for Palm. And so I came with this kind of fun, innovative tool set of all this digital marketing. And that wasn't even a term at the time, but that's effectively what it was. We were doing roughly about 10% of all the company revenue through the website back when I was there, which is super exciting, right? I mean, that was it. Literally, I have this magazine that came, I think it was in 2003, and it shows the top 50 e-commerce websites in the world, and Amazon was like 5 and above us. And we were on the same list with Amazon back then, which is crazy today, because obviously Amazon is just like taken off. But back then they were an upstart. But anyway, so that was really kind of like I think, what did we call it at the time, the consumerization of IT or something like that, where decision making became more online, which it hadn't been in the past. And that was a big opportunity for companies, and we capitalized on that. We learned how to build interesting ways for people to interact with us, where they could learn from us, where they could contact us and get the information and identify where they were in the purchase process. And that was something that didn't really exist before that. And so that's what you're talking about, that kind of that transition from 1.0, web 1.0, which was really about, here's my online brochure, to 2.0, which is now you can interact with me at some level. You could purchase, or you could contact me, or what have you, to 3.0, where you just run all your businesses online.
Yeah, and going back to your word, sort of consumerization, one of the main thing on the tech side we started to talk about was this whole buyer's journey. We never talked about it because it was a very consumer centric thinking, that awareness, interest, trial, purchase, that literally came out from that madman world, sort of, advertise, drive traffic, give them a coupon, try at a point of purchase conversion. So as that started to happen, like move, walk us through this whole journey. And I want to go back to that Eloqua discussion and then talk about different forms of content. Can you talk a little bit about how that evolution happened? And it almost took a decade before lead scoring, and then inbound came around from HubSpot. That was a big thing in the late 2000s with their entry. So talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's a couple of really great points there. I think the lead scoring one. Okay, so first of all, let's talk about kind of what happened. Again, early on site, then you added a phone number, then you added the ability for them to contact you, then you started adding interactive elements, right, where things could go back and forth. All of that happened because, just like you see with today, people figured out these new technologies. And because of the way the web is, it's all shared. At that time, you literally would go find somebody who did something interesting, and you would pull up the source code for their website, and you would diagnose what they did, and then copy the things that you think were the most interesting. That's how this whole thing got started. Was basically somebody built something, somebody built on top of it, you built on top of it, and you built on top of it, and you basically were inspired by the techniques that other people were using, or stole it from them. And then you just kind of moved quick, and that allowed us to very rapidly, I would say, from the early 2002 2003 to by the time we were talking about 2007 and 8, the level of sophistication just like jumped. It wasn't just you had a database where you can send emails occasionally. Now you had like intelligence. You knew when somebody was on your website, and that could inform some of the content that you were sending out in an email. And so over that period of time, the intelligence became much more interesting. The ability for us to modify content became much more interesting. And the more the people did that, the more they realized the I can market to somebody with problems that they're trying to solve, with the things that they're interested in. My conversion rates are so much higher. I can generate so much more revenue. In fact, I remember when I was with Palm, there was a time we were coming up to the end of the quarter. I think we were a month away. It did not look like we were going to make our number. The CEO called the marketing team and said some crazy ideas. How can we do it? And so, running e-commerce, we did this promotional thing, which required like email database and intelligence and all this other stuff. And we ended up making our numbers. We did this crazy campaign. We also got a bunch of calls and complaints from the channel. So we had to pull back immediately on what we were doing because it was a little too aggressive. But that was the great thing about it. We developed techniques to be able to scale up and scale down. And then we had to address that challenge where, especially with e-commerce, with the channel, which is less of an issue today. But back in 2005, 2006, that was the biggest issue. Like, the channel partners would get really upset if you're selling anything aggressively online, because they weren't as sophisticated online. They couldn't compete with you online, and it became kind of a big issue. But anyway, so then we kind of came through that, and we had the intelligence of what people looked at on your site, and you had the emails, what's clicked, what's opened, maybe their purchases, and that's it. It wasn't anything like today where we can look at intent and which other sites did they go to, and kind of the history of things over a longer period of time. Back then, your horizon was like a couple of weeks to a couple of months, and data was expensive, so you didn't hold on too much as we do today. So just a completely different world. It's been really exciting to be part of that and to help move it along over the years.
That's amazing. So let's now come to the iPhone era, 2007. This
Yeah.
is sort of, you come out of Web 1.0, and we're kind of moving into both commerce and mobile kind of coming together. and this explosion of apps happen for the next 10 years, right?
Yeah.
And the marketing on the consumer side moves to another dimension in in-app marketing and web marketing. And then can you talk to us a little bit of how the consumer space, as it evolved, how much of those technology or tactics kind of bled into or seeped into on the B2B side?
Yeah, I want to say it was around 2005, 2006, where on the B2B enterprise side, specifically on the security side, where there was this idea of bring your own device to work, right? And so to your point, everybody had their phone and, everybody was bringing it into the office. Some people had their own laptop and they're bringing it into the office, and that kind of signaled that there's a change going on. And as it relates to marketing, that change became pretty profound because now all of a sudden we had a way to communicate with people, and it is a new way to communicate with people, and it isn't that easy, especially time, to track somebody across a laptop and a phone and know it's the same person. And so you would have to advertise to them kind of like, is a laptop and Sugata is a phone, but the data between the two wasn't shared. So I only know over here what you've done on the phone, and I only know. That was a really interesting thing. And from B2B, that became an interesting challenge. We didn't really have the IP lookup, so that we knew what company you were from, and so everything became personalized based on just the tiniest amount of information that we had on you. And the fortunate thing is we were able to then take from B2C, which had been doing this for a while. The B2C brands, they spent a lot of money on brand, they spent a lot of money on digital even back then. And so we were able to steal those ideas, we were able to leverage and build upon them and do really interesting things over on the B2B side, which included, like I said, messaging you to the phone through email, SMS, because SMS was too expensive back then. We were able to target you with advertising, sometimes in app. But again, a lot of times the in app folks didn't really have good data on you. They just knew that you were somebody who showed an interest in something because you happened to download that app. And so we would advertise to you. And so the net is those early days, the ROI was not awesome on those types of, in-app advertising and targeting. Even email wasn't. At one time very early on where email was like gangbusters. It was because there wasn't a lot of spam. So when you got an email, you read your email. Nowadays, 90% of the stuff you get is spam. So, or unwanted email. Maybe you signed up to forgot to unsubscribe or, didn't get around to it. But 90% of your inbox you ignore. And that was not the case early on. So, this has been the one of the fun things with marketing is it's a bit like a chess game where, hey, let's go do out of home. Out of home's kind of crowded. Nobody's really paying attention. We're not going to do out of home. We're going to do radio. Now we're going to do TV. Now we're going to do digital. We're going to do email. We're going to do social. We're going to do, and you have to constantly go back. I actually did this podcast the other day, and it was about one of the challenges with general in B2B organizations is they'll try something, like content syndication, and they tried it. It didn't work one time. They will never do content syndication again because it was a waste of their money. One, maybe you didn't do it right, right? You didn't have the right content or you didn't have the right targeting. Number two, the market changes constantly. And a great example of that is I have found over the last 3, 4, 5 years that direct mail, meaning sending somebody to somebody's office, is actually fairly effective these days because not everybody does it. Who would think that like the madmen sending stuff to people's houses or their work would work? But it is, which is kind of crazy. Radio, especially digital, and terrestrial, those seem to be actually performing again. They're having a day. But then some of the other stuff like social that's become so saturated has lost effectiveness. So as a marketer, this podcast I was talking about is like, don't let yourself fall into that trap of I tried it once and it didn't work, so I'm never going to do it again. You have to come at it with fresh eyes occasionally and go try it again. And that is one of the fun things about this and what has really helped to change the market and make us all much more effective in 2025 versus 2005.
So let's build on that a little bit. So if you think about the buyer's journey and like how sort of buyers find out, let's stay focused on B2B. Is the journey a lot more complicated as a marketer? I mean, have the tools become easier? Like you can load up a campaign in social, or create content for search or LLMs. Like, what is happening right now in your mind? Are there too many tactics, but totally confused, or like what is happening at the moment with that journey?
You know, I'm going to go a little bit sideways and then come back. So I would say that the number one challenge is that we still hold on to the old metaphors in our mind. So, there used to be a day, and stay focused on B2B. There used to be a day you would put a web form up on your website and you'd be able to measure how many leads you got from that, how many of those turned into a deal. The playbook is not a simple one touch thing anymore. It's multi-touch. So you've got, the web, you've got email, you got social. And to your point, maybe we have too many aspects. We have SMS. Like, I can't tell you the number of vendors that send me stuff through SMS. You've got different derivatives of social networks. You've got literally advertising. Like, you'll go shopping for something on Amazon and you'll see an ad for a B2B thing, right? And so, like, the vehicles have just exponentially increased, which means that we're no longer dealing with like a single touch being the thing that converts somebody. It's a combination of those things, and which combination works. And in a recent cybersecurity company that I was with, the playbook was really simple. It was, we see a person at an event, we then market to them and get them to engage with content syndication. And then we pull them into a webinar or a dinner with our sales execs, or even our corporate execs. And that was our playbook for basically generating the most pipeline. That's not a web form. That's not just like a dinner. That's a multi-touch thing. And that becomes part of the challenge. But to the point of what you asked, we have so many things that we could do that with now, that it is overwhelming to most people. But we have the tools that can do it. There's a ton of orchestration platforms. Everybody from Adobe, Adobe has actually a pretty sophisticated suite of these. You've got companies like Sixth Sense, Demand Base. I know these folks really well, and they have built tools that allow you to look across that and do that, and do it relatively easily. And they give you different signals that you wouldn't have otherwise. Because in the past, B2B, you run your site, you do your own email. So, like, those are the signals you have. Now all of a sudden you work with somebody like Sixth Sense or Demand Base, you have sensors on all of their network and all their partner networks. And you can see that somebody has downloaded, a webinar or, case study from some other site that you've never had a relationship with, but indicates that person's in a purchase cycle. And those tools are just readily available, which is what is so different over, again, looking at the last 20 years. We were dealing with stone tools back then. Like, yeah, maybe we had an Eloqua, but what Eloqua is capable of, or Marketo, or any of them, are significantly more impactful than what we had even back then.
So if I sort of, for discussion's sake, to simplify it, if I kind of create a 2x2, you have mid-market and enterprise. I'll keep SMB out for the moment.
Yeah.
Mid-market and enterprise. And then on the y-axis, you have transactional product and solutions, right?
Yeah.
Solutions would be complex, sales cycle, POC, and all those others. Is there a way to map tools and tactics? Is it possible for you to walk us through each of those quadrants? Like, if I'm thinking about digital marketing, right, or go-to-market engineering, whatever it's called today, what is called today? How is it structured? How would I approach, from a leadership perspective, thinking about these quadrants?
No, that's a great point. I would argue that the difference between mid-market and enterprise is not as be in the past. And I think one of the things, like, when I was with Seagate years ago, we in Sixth Sense, and it was ridiculously expensive. And I, in my mind, I kind of stuck for a little bit of, yeah, unless a big company, we're never going to use Sixth Sense. But Sixth Sense, of course, being smart, moved down market and offered some things to the mid market. So now the capabilities, I would argue, with intent and listening and all that, is not that different between enterprise and the medium-sized business. Again, when I was at Seagate, we were investing in AI through IBM, right? Only the most expensive companies were doing that at the time, right? When I had a big budget, and so I was able to do that. But fast forward, I personally invest in AI. I personally have a subscription, a couple of them, and I'm able to go build stuff that is way more sophisticated than I did when I worked for, basically a Fortune 100 company. And so I would argue there's not as much difference between the two of those, but there is a pretty difference. I would say that's the big significant thing. And then, with, high impact, low impact. After other access, it was
Transactional product and solution.
transactional and consultative. Yeah. And I think that one actually is probably a really big indicator. A consultative one, or more of a solutions based approach, you're going to have more people involved in the decision. It's probably a bigger deal, cost wise. And so, you are going to see that tend to be larger organizations. But I think, particularly in the day of today, where we have a whole bunch of SaaS companies that are small and not necessarily making much money as the big guys, they're still spending as much as the big guys, especially on technology, because that's how they've competed and differentiated, moved up market. So anyways, when you look at one side, like if you look at marketing operations as an example, Eloqua, now owned by Oracle, obviously that's mostly enterprise. That sits up in that upper right where, it's definitely solutions based. It's definitely enterprise. And then you've got companies like Marketo that is still in that quadrant, but then they serve much better, further down. They have a very competitive thing for the mid-size company and even smaller. They have scaling a feature set that, allowed to keep the price point down, offer a lot of those same capabilities at a better price. And by the way, both the two of them are being disrupted by a half a dozen more new upstarts that have come into the marketplace to kind of, they're starting as bottom feeders, of course, but they've worked their way up to the mid market as well now. And we're seeing quite a few of those. And so I think that changes it. But again, that's example one tool set. I would say the same thing with, intent listening. You got 6sense. I still kind of in the upper right. It is an enterprise tool, although it does come down to mid market. It is relatively expensive, but they brought the price into a place that most markets can afford it. In fact, I've worked for a bunch of mid markets that afford, including a couple of startups that have invested in it because the information is so important. You can take that intent data, and it's not just intent, but it's also profile data. I know that Sugata cares about channel marketing, so channel marketing tool he's going to be interested. I know that Sugata works for mid-sized companies, so I've got that on you, and I know that you've been on a bunch of these websites over the last couple of months showing an intent that you're in a cycle. And so like you can bring all those things together, the demographic, the firmographic, and then of course the intent. And that's what something like a 6sense does well, demand based kind of a little bit more. And then you've got dozens of companies that are coming up after them right now. And this is the great thing about marketing. You are constantly seeing disruption. You may get comfortable thinking like early on in my career, it was Netscape, right? Netscape had servers, Netscape had a browser, everything was Netscape. And then all these companies came in, including Apache and other ones that just started disrupting it. They took away the server business. Other browsers came in, Chrome, God, what was it called before Edge? What was Microsoft browser? It was anyways.
I forget.
Yeah,
Explorer?
yes, Microsoft Explorer.
Yeah.
You had all these folks that disrupted it, and nobody even thinks about Netscape anymore. I mean, the closest we do is Mozilla or something like that.
But I want to go back, Rick, kind of ask you. So you simplified for me. I mean, when we're at Sonical, we used to say there is no such thing as a small business, a virus. I think what I'm hearing from you is that the high end of the enterprise, where they have millions of records and database to market, there may be sophisticated tools. But when it comes to, in general, mid-market and enterprise marketing stack, it's roughly converging. They may be different provider, but the tactics that you need from a digital perspective, they're converging into a stack. But on the what you're selling, whether transactional or solution, you have to have different approaches. I want to bring a generational dynamics into this. So today we have 5 generations at work, right? All the way through to Gen Alpha even entering. Mm-hmm. Can you talk to us a little bit about like how they consume and engage with content and trust, what it means to them based on tactics and networks that they're part of?
Yeah, consume and trust. So interesting. I would say, and we've seen this from millennials forward, they consume social media content at a much higher rate than generations. Let's not forget that, in our time frame, the internet became a thing. It wasn't a thing, all of our lives. Whereas our children have never been in a world without the internet. My children don't know a world where they didn't have a laptop, right, or a cell phone or what have you. So it's interesting, and what that does is it drives a lot of behavior. So the older generations are slower to adopt. It doesn't mean they don't adopt. Like there's a ton of Gen X, baby boomers, even the greatest generation that are currently on social, right? But assume at the same rate that the youngest do. They don't research it at the same way, the same rate. And so I think that that's a big differentiator. But I think the second one goes to your point about trust is the later generations, because they grew up in it and because they've been with it, they trust it less. And I think this is one of the things that we struggle with as a society right now is there's definitely generations that trust too much what they see online versus the younger folks who are very pessimistic, which I think is really interesting. And in fact, my son the other day sent me a note. He's like, please don't be one of those old people who trust everything that you see online and believe all the politics. It's like, I'm not that guy, but I'm pessimistic by nature. So that's a big one. I would say that video has been a really interesting one. The older generation taken a long time to come to video, and they're now, but the younger generations absolutely did video much earlier, and they've gone to shorter and shorter formats, and that's why the rise of TikTok or Reels or what have you has been so significant, is because they would rather do bite-sized pieces and listen to very short segments. And you're seeing that even on LinkedIn, right? A professional network, very B2B centric. You're seeing that a lot of people post these short form videos versus long ones. And then there are folks that stand out. Remember, I talked earlier about people assume a marketing tactic is like something because that's you assume long form content doesn't work anymore. And then the Diary of the CEO comes out and it's 2 hours long and it's the #2 podcast in the world, right? Because they broke that mold and they figured out a formula to offer value. So, anyways, the younger generation though, they don't tend to really look at that. So they rely on their social networks. They have a keen distrust of information online. They consume content in shorter formats, and frankly, personal reference isn't as important as it is with some of the older generations. I'd say millennials in particular, very keen on a person recommending something to them. Gen X, boomers, same thing. But the younger generations, when you get to Z or Alpha, they're probably because they don't have a lot of friends in their network that are more senior. They don't really have that trust or the peer review. So I think those are all things that you have to take into account when you're growing a business or trying to do a marketing program.
So I want to go back to the buyer's journey, and I want to kind of stay on this trust notion a little bit. So it used to be awareness, interest, trial, purchase, and then, renew, upgrades, all those things. But you essentially kind of trusted a provider during the trial process because you kind of validated. And what I've been hearing, not from a tech stack provider, but also several folks in the Valley, is that awareness, interest, there's another I called impression. And that impression, as you kind of pointing out, the younger generation, their impression of a solution or of a brand, it comes from their peers, the peer fluence thing. So can you talk to us a little bit about what is happening with the old analyst world? Because in B2B, the way you build trust, you create an impression of a brand. You kind of looked at Gartner and IDC and Forrester. That played it. If you're not in that quadrant, right, you're sort of like, oh man, this is possibly not a tier one solution. So from an impression perspective, how is that playing out with these social sites like G2 and Capterra and these other things are playing, then social reviews and posting? Can you talk to a little bit about that?
Yeah, I won't claim to be an expert on this, but I'll give you a few impressions that I've had from talking to folks at different points in their career. I still think there's a place for many of those, but I think, the Gartners and the Forresters of the world have undermined themselves a little bit with, is really what it comes to. Like, I'll give you an example. One of the companies I worked for puts out a report every 18 months. In that space, what has changed over 18 months? Like, half of the people that they put right isn't even there anymore. They're not even in that space anymore, right? And then you've got all these upstarts that come. So the data becomes too aged by the time they get it out. Something like a Capterra or G2 is a little bit better because it's a little more real time, But I think that people know that there's a certain aspect of pay to play with those. You can, go and do review programs with them to try and get people to influence it. People only send over customers that they think are going to give good reviews. And I think that, again, the younger generations being pessimistic see right through that. And so they don't have the same gravitas that they did in the past. And some of that is, on the vendor's own fault, because they're stringent and their responsiveness isn't quite there. But some of it is just generationally. There's just isn't as much trust because they've seen way too much online that isn't real. And I think things like don't help this at all. Like, I just saw a video of Michael Jackson playing ping pong the other day, right? And it's incredibly convincing. But it obviously wasn't him; it was AI. So like that distrust, the natural distrust online, is increasing now, and so that really affects things like these review websites if they don't really establish, and be transparent with how they're working to ensure that there's some quality. So I think there's a bunch of opportunity there. I don't think that space is gone. I think that there's still value in those reviews. The people still consider it as part of the buying process. But now I think the trial is really the key. If you don't offer a trial, if you don't offer them the ability to put their hands on it and to see if it's really going to do what you say it does, I think that impacts you quite a bit.
So let's go to sort of the Gen Z, which is kind of moving into from influencer to a budget owner role.
Yeah.
And if that their whole journey is fragmented, sort of with trust deficient sort of a system, and you went there, I was about to go there about this whole AI based fake videos, whether you good for you and bad for competitors. You can just flood the zone, right?
Yeah.
You can create fake reviews for your competitor. And there has always been a dark side in Silicon Valley where instead of just promoting your stuff, you also influence the press to write negative stuff about your competitors, right? So
Totally.
what is happening there in your mind? Where do you think this thing is going? Maybe 12, 24 months horizon.
Yeah. I just listened to this podcast the other day, and the point that they made is it's almost for us to project future, because it's the thing that we coming that is the disruptive thing that happens. And so, yeah, I was involved in an AI company back in 2016, 17. So I had this idea that AI was going to become a thing, but I really thought it was going to be an enterprise thing. And then all of a sudden chat gpt came out of nowhere, and it completely blindsided me. I didn't see that one coming, and especially at the level that it is right now. So to your point, I think that that's been really disruptive. But just like everything else that's happened in the past, when newspapers plentiful, like everybody had a newspaper, it was pretty easy to do printing, or everybody had a website, everybody had a blog. You always go through a cycle where, as all these people flood to the market, with whichever technology, there's a drop in trust, because you get all this stuff that is poorly informed, not fully researched, or yet maybe intentionally obtuse. And so I think right now, I think we're seeing that with AI, where there's just so much capability for everybody to get AI, writing content, AI is creating videos, whatever, that I think there's a lack of trust right now. And we'll see. I'm optimistic in this respect. I believe we'll come out the other side. We'll see get a little bit better. But to your secondary question, which was around, like particularly Gen Z, them becoming, budget owners, them being distrustful of, media in general, advertising, as well as, all this internet stuff. I do have to say that I think what's going to happen there, and I'm projecting, is that they're going to turn back to work. Right. And so I think, that hasn't been a big part as they've come up in their career. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that, their peers junior like them, and they're all trying to figure out at the same time, as they all get a little bit more, further along in their career, a little bit more knowledgeable. I think that then they become a network that will help each other out. And so I do think that that's going to be, in a couple of years, that's going to be the primary way that people get, information or referrals on stuff. And when they validate it, they're going to go to their network, because they want to talk to people that are like them, that have used something, and they're going to trust that a lot more than anything else. Which to me, it comes back to we can't ever feel like we're going to go digital. We have to have a little bit of that human element to it, because the more automated everything becomes, the less trust people have and all that, the more we're going to trust each other more than we're going to trust what we find online. So I think that that's what we're going to see over the next couple of years, a kind of return back to peer reviews, peer recommendations, peer validation is going to become much more strong. And then I think we're going to really get to the point where a lot of the distrustworthy stuff that we're seeing come up with AI is going to go away. That phase will be done. There'll be some sort of way to validate things. I even seen this recently on LinkedIn. I posted a blog post where I'd used AI to generate the thumbnail image. That thumbnail image was tagged as generated by AI. And so I think we're starting to get there. And I think that's a thing. That transparency and that trust will be built, though, over time.
So coming sort of back to today, Rick, are there practical applications that you're seeing in the marketing space other than just content creation and rewriting stuff? What are the applications are you seeing from Gen A or even MLAI
Yeah.
perspective in the marketing space?
I'll tell you right now, I think AI is the greatest multiplier in marketing, if people can get their head around it. I think there's a lot of fear right now, this fear of AI is going to replace my job, and for some people that's true, and I minimize that. But I will tell you, more than not, it's going to be a multiplier. So just as an example, if you're trying to do research, and I did this recently, actually, I did a whole effort around this of we were trying to, for that I was working with, we were trying to figure out which markets we wanted to go into, right? And so, first of all, you need to look at census data to figure out how many likely ICPs do you have in each region? How many people are working in those industries? So you pull that data in from census, cross reference that with where your competitors' offices are, where your offices are, where their laboratories are. And you can pull all this data together to come up with, here are 3 markets that I think that we should go after. That's made possible. Like, you could do that manually. Oh my God, that would take forever. Using something like AI to pull in, this mass data from all these different systems and then help you generate a conclusion. That's where I think marketing is going to be really enabled. So these tools that we're using, these analytics tools, these customer segmentation tools, all these things that we're doing today, AI is going to help make us better at what we're doing there. Repetitive playbooks, it's going to help us get that done. And then I know it's a big hot topic. People don't love that AI writes a lot of content. I don't use it to write my content. I use it to make some edits. I use it to help me brainstorm, and it's extremely effective at that. And I can get through things much more quickly than I did before because I'm able to use it to brainstorm. And then at the end, I have to write it. It has to be my voice. It has to be me, authentic me. But I use AI. That's what marketing is going to do. Being able to do A/B tests on the fly and be more specific and like Google's a great example of this. Okay, first of all, I have to say this: everybody thought that AI was going to destroy Google. What we didn't realize, and I was one of them. We didn't realize is that Google had been investing in AI for years, and they probably didn't bring it out because it would impact their advertising business. But when it came to they actually needed to release it, they jumped ahead of everyone else. Like Sora 2 is amazing if you haven't seen it. The visuals that come out of that is just incredible. That wasn't developed overnight. They've been working on that for a while. And so I think that's really interesting. But one of the ones that they did, I think it was called Max, it was the advertising tool called Max, used AI to help you do bid management. And I tested it when I was with Sentinel One. We tested it extensively. It outperformed our humans every single time, and it was really impressive. It also did some stupid things, and we had to keep an eye on it. But in general, like if I ran a campaign and we had a bunch of humans doing it alone, it was not nearly as effective, maybe twice as effective when I used Max. And so it was a multiplier for the people. They still didn't come up with all the right keywords. They didn't know our positioning and all that. But with the humans doing that part, it did the grunt work of figuring out which bids and how much and which markets.
That's amazing. I have one last question. It may take a few minutes to kind of get through that, which is about organizational design. But before we get there, I want to go back to kind of where you started from, right? From your career wise, you said you wanted to be a graphic designer, then you sort of moved into these database marketing, which in the 80s, Land,
Yeah.
Sears,
Yeah.
they were like the leading brand that they were targeting segmentation, right? Factor analysis, cluster analysis,
That's right.
putting different catalogs out. Then Time Magazine came out, different ads for different people, right? Based on that zip code segmentation and incomes and all those stuff. So digits and database, they have been constantly converging, in different formats. As you said, there was Netscape, now we got, Google, and now we got Gemini, now we have
That's right.
OpenAI, right? Different form, but it's like that point of convergence. And on the other side, this whole notion of, because marketing is about not just creating awareness, but also creating trust in the brand, right?
That's right.
That's changing how that's influenced. So when you bring those vectors together and you think forward an organization over the next 3 years, dial back a little bit. What skills you would have looked for 20 years ago, 10 years ago, and now
You know,
as a CMO as you build this out?
yeah, when hiring people, I literally just had a conversation about this with somebody a couple days ago. For quite some time, throughout my career, I've kind of refined this model of what I'm looking for in a human being when I'm role. And I've refined it and refined it and refined it. And I've probably hired hundreds of people at this point. At one point, I had 100 people working for me when I was at Seagate. And so I look for three things in a human being when I'm hired. The first one is critical thinking. And I think that's important more today than ever. The ability to see around a corner and adapt what you're doing to where it needs to go, I think is a critical skill that everybody should have. And it's something that I encourage everybody who works for me to work. The second one is passion. I think if you're not passionate about a job, go find a different job. Like, you need to love what I love marketing. I man gen. I do. I mean, that's why I have a podcast. That's why I do all the things that I do, is because I get so excited. I just want to share it with everybody. Here's all the stuff that we're doing. Here's what we tried. Here's what didn't work. Here's what did work. So I have a passion for what you do. It makes your job, makes you more effective at your job, makes your life a lot happier when you do it. And then the third thing is just self-awareness, and that comes down to lifelong learning as well, and the constantly going back and improving yourself. And so when you have a combination of those three elements, those are obviously all the soft skills. When you have all those three soft skills, you can do almost anything. Like, I've found that when I take bets on people who don't have as much experience as I'm looking for, but they have those three criteria, they have wowed me every single time. I have somebody that worked for me at Sentinel One, just became a CMO somewhere. Right, that was somebody I mentored. That was somebody I worked with, and a bunch of people are directors, senior directors. I think one's a VP now, and so like I love like finding those people with skills and then helping to nurture. So anyway, so that's on the hard side. I think being open and learning about AI is really important. I think it's very polarizing right now, and people want to hate. There's definitely fear and all that, but you have to understand it because it will be part of everything you do in the future. It's something that you interact with direct, or it's built into a tool that you're using, like any of these ones we talked about, Marketo, 6sense. Like, it's going to be built into every one of those. So understanding the concept of it and having some experience with it is super critical for you. And then, the other thing is just go hard on learning your industry. I learn everything I can. I listen to podcasts every day on marketing. I do one on marketing, but I still feel like I can learn a lot more. And so, like, just going back to that lifelong learner, you just gotta double down on it. So my advice to people in this would be, focus on those three skills, focus on learning AI, and then just do every consumption you can of content around the space that you're in, whether it's marketing operations, demand generation, branding, whatever. Just, consume the content as rapidly as much as you can.
So with that incredible point, we're going to try to bring this to a close. Rick, thanks for being here. I'd love to have you back in 6 months to see where things are at, but thank you for being here.
Thank you, Scott. It was great being here. I appreciate being invited.